in our class we distinguish between broadly consequentialist ethical frameworks and then frameworks that put constraints on consequentialist frameworks. So utilitarianism would be one famous consequentialist system that just says you got to produce the best results for the most people on the whole. And it seems like a lot of economics works in a kind of broadly utilitarian consequentialist mode. But you might think that it's consistent with working for the best results for the most people, that some people on the margins just get left out. The most people might succeed in a system or be happiest in a system where there's some real injustice on the margins and some people are left malnourished or are left to die effectively. And so it sounds like you, as well as a lot of the people in this discussion and the UN body that claims that we all have a right to food, want to put some constraints on a consequentialist framework and think, no, in extreme cases, we need to look not just at overall happiness for the aggregate or something like that, but really be concerned about the lives of the individuals and say sometimes we have to prefer them and consider an obligation to them, even if it's not making for the best overall happiness for the most or something like that. Does that sound right?
That sounds right.
Yeah.
I mean, it brings to mind the sort of concept that developed in the 1960s in the Catholic Church, preferential treatment of the poor. I
Right.
think that it will be a better society if we preferentially ensure that those who are most vulnerable, who have preferential access to food and have more of a say over how we organize our system.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that would be best, though not maybe in a kind of utilitarian scheme.
And I also think there are other ethical dimensions to questions about food and agriculture.
Yeah.
As a North American, I think we have benefited from this unequal system historically and in the contemporary period to the detriment of people in places like Malawi.
Okay.
And so I think we owe them the time and resources to try to ensure that they have greater access and have more of a say over how food is produced.
So kind of in the logic of reparation.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And really, if you think about the long history of the slave trade, the colonial period, and then the sort of modernization period where there was still sort of neo-imperialist and neo-colonialist systems set up, and then structural adjustment, you see a long history of places like Malawi paying more in terms of people, in terms of resources, in terms of money to countries like Canada, like the United States and the United Kingdom. So we've benefited in terms of our economy and in terms of our population. We have benefited from that. So I feel we owe them, yes.
But let me just push a little further on that, because one of the major ethical frameworks we're looking at in the class is consequentialism or utilitarianism. And there it doesn't look like there's a right to life on the part of individuals. What you want, it's this maximizing effort. You'd want to maximize happiness or pleasure and minimize pain for the most, in a kind of median way or average way. People debate how it goes. But there's no claim that any one particular individual has a claim to life or a right to life and thereby a right to food.
That's right.
So does it look like these secular reasons and these bodies that are ascribing rights to people aren't consequentialist, aren't utilitarian?
Well, I would agree that I think as soon as you start talking about rights and moral obligations, we're now talking about constraints on choice. And consequentialism is intrinsically about maximizing some aggregate effect. And you can impose constraints on that. I argue that we do want to try to pursue particular desirable consequences, but subject to constraints. And the constraints on those are, in particular, we need to respect each individual's most fundamental rights. So once we have a population that is adequately nourished, I don't think it's our obligation to ensure that everybody enjoys shrimp cocktails every Saturday night.
Yeah, sure.
That's clearly somewhat absurd. But so we would be pursuing any of a variety of allocations that we think maximizes some version of well-being, and then you can argue over the right economic system. But all such consequential systems need to be subject to some sort of rights constraints on our collective choice.
That's interesting. So, I mean, just for the students again, this is a case of an economist arguing that consequentialism and utilitarianism needs to be constrained in certain important contexts, and that there's this unalienable or quasi-unalienable right to life, and thereby a right to food that constrains our maximizing urges.
Well, it's important to keep in mind, we economists, we use methods and we believe that people largely engage in constrained maximization or constrained optimization generally. So, you and I choose how best to use our time subject to we can't violate there are only 24 hours in the day.
Yeah.
Or how best to spend our money subject to we can't go beyond our credit limit on our credit card and our balance in our checking account.
Right, constrained.
So there are constraints in our choices individually. This is just the analog at a collective level, at the community level.
Okay.